Hi, everyone. Welcome to our presentation today. My name is Charles Rogel. I work as the Chief Consulting Officer here at DecisionWise. Today, we are going to be talking about employee engagement survey best practices, but we're responding more to questions that we've gathered from you all over the past month or so as we've been promoting this webinar that are very specific to your needs and kind of tie into some of the typical questions and responses that we get. Just in way of introduction, again, we're based here in Springville, Utah. It's a beautiful sunny day today on the 27th of March as we broadcast live. And I'm joined by my colleague here, Thomas Olson.
Hello. Yeah, my name's Thomas Olson. I'm a senior consultant here at DecisionWise. My head is not bigger than Charles's in real life. It just looks bigger here on the...
I'll try to match.
I'm just closer to my screen, but I've been here for at DecisionWise for almost 6 years. 6 years in August. Really enjoy working with engagement surveys. We do a lot of 360 assessments here as well, coaching for feedback for different leaders. So good to be with everyone.
And Thomas, I noticed an accent in your voice. Are you originally from the United States?
Yeah. No, I was born and raised in Denmark, in Copenhagen, and so I've lived here for 18 years. It'll actually be 19 years this summer. My wife is from the U.S. I'm a dual citizen now, so I've been here for quite a while. And both Charles and I are located in Utah. So.
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, I don't notice an accent. In fact, I never would have guessed that you were born and raised there. So I joke about that with you all the time. Our agenda is pretty simple. We've kind of bucketed a lot of these questions that we received into these different topics, trends, kind of an overview of what engagement is, how we measure it, survey design, best practices, things like that. A lot of this, we hope to provide kind of real practical nuts and bolts advice to help you kind of get the best out of conducting surveys within your organization. We've been around for 29 years doing this, and so we've gathered a lot of data, have a lot of experience, kind of seen everything, and so we'll try to add that in as we go. We do want to encourage you to use the chat feature and to submit questions as well, additional questions or comments or even experiences that you have. If you can add to the conversation, that is great. We really want to leverage everyone's experience here as we go. One question that comes up is kind of what trends do you see? And we typically see this kind of on kickoff calls with clients as we're starting a survey and they're thinking about what they want to measure and understand from their employee population. And we started doing this at the beginning of the pandemic because everything kind of changed. And there was a greater emphasis, as you can see in 2020, on safety, DEI initiatives and questions, communication, productivity, and collaboration. And this list, we kind of call it our top 5, employee, trend list, has changed a bit. And essentially, this is kind of what we're hearing from our customers, what they're concerned, what they want to measure, what we're also picking up as we look at survey results from different clients, kind of what's a hot spot or what's a need or what's a trend that we're seeing. Going all the way over to 2025 now, we still see compensation coming up as a larger concern for employees with the concerns around inflation, cost of living, that sort of thing. And so that appears usually in the comments section because we usually say, don't ask about it unless you have plans to make some changes there. Workload is usually a concern in certain areas, although that has actually improved a bit from what we measured back after the pandemic. Culture, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging are still important topics. We're seeing that there's kind of been somewhat of a natural de-emphasis on DEI. It's been folded under culture, but there's been even a stronger emphasis now in terms of measuring culture as opposed to DEI maybe as directly as we have in the past. And that's somewhat of a shame. So we feel like DEI is still very important and it should be measured and it is an important topic. But due to political reasons, obviously, there's been a shift. Processes has really been an issue. And then communication, we're seeing kind of less agreement on statements related to that topic. Thomas, anything else you want to add in terms of what you're seeing or hearing with your clients?
No, I think these are some of the, these were some of our predictions that we did together as a consulting group. And, compensation is always tricky because I think, most employees out there, they want to get paid more.
Yeah.
But sometimes they're okay, right? But it's like, it's just top of mind for a lot of people. And so that's why we often see it as one of the main themes in our comments. But to Charles's point, if we ask about compensation, do you feel like your compensation is fair? Or we would expect that question to score a bit lower because people just generally, if they're asked about it, they will say, hey, yes,
Yeah.
I want to get paid more. So, and if we could do it as an organization, hopefully that would be on the agenda, and we would try to increase compensation. We would try to be competitive in our market. And so, just one of those that
It's constant battle.
yeah, constant battle.
Yeah. So no, good points. And so, and this is kind of what we see. It does vary a bit by client, but processes and communication kind of entering the list and climbing a bit compared to what we saw over previous years. So the first question we want to address is kind of how to get leadership buy-in. So the typical scenario we see is that there's some support, obviously, from the HR group to do a survey. We want to understand people's perceptions. We're concerned about retention and creating a good employee experience. But it really depends a lot of times on the CEO of the organization. If they're more people-oriented, depends on other leaders and how accepting and supportive they are of getting feedback, because sometimes getting feedback from the organization is tough. And so you're trying to create a reason to kind of do this and use this data and work with an organization. We've listed here some of the reasons, right? Retention costs. Retention's a big one. Normally, clients will say, it costs a lot, turnover costs us a lot, and we're trying to retain people, and we're trying to maintain a competitive advantage. And when you're competing on just compensation alone, it's hard because people are very sensitive to $1 more an hour, for example, in the hourly position. So if you can create a better working environment, that will usually keep people staying with your organization longer. Even if they might get paid $1 more an hour somewhere else, they're like, well, I really like it here. This place is better. I've heard things about that other place that aren't so great. And so it creates a competitive advantage if you have a great place to work compared to other organizations. In general, I'll say bullet point number 2 is that payroll is your biggest expense, your people component, the capital expense of your payroll. And so as you're saying, okay, we're investing a lot in our people here, or we're paying a lot for people, hopefully we're making a great experience in a good environment where they want to work and perform their best. And that gets us to point number 3 around the engagement. That engagement really drives performance. I got a slide as well that shows some data on these topics. Thomas, you want to talk about the other 2 points in terms of leveraging, success from previous surveys and whatnot?
Yeah, I think, sometimes the first survey can be the tougher one to get buy-in on. You have some CEOs out there, some senior leaders that are naturally interested. They've done it before. They found that it was valuable. And the more that we can go back and show, we did this before, we did this with another organization that I worked at, and here were some of the things that we saw. We've always, we have found that when we do follow-up surveys, things and people have taken action, it increases the perception, then it increases engagement in a positive way. So that's sort of what we mean by, how does the actions from the last survey result in improved perceptions and improved performance as well. Mm-hmm. And some of the things that we do, we can give managers access. If they had 5 or more people, that's usually our confidentiality threshold. We can give them access to their data so they can see some of the insights for their teams. Maybe we have an action plan in place for those teams that have lower engagement, have lower perceptions. And, we always want to frame it in a positive way. It's never sort of an internal competition, but it's more, what are some of the insights now for the CEO? What are some of the departments that are struggling a little bit? What are some of the leaders out there that we need to focus on and help? Because if we can bring some of those lower scoring teams that have lower engagement, if we could bring them up to the same level as everybody else, I think we'd see huge improvements, across the organization as well.
Yeah, and I'll talk about, we had a slide as well that kind of addressed kind of how you progress year over year and using the data. But typically you're just trying to, like, if you get data in the hands of your leaders, they usually respond. Like, they're usually incented. It's kind of a catalyst to do something about it. And so most leaders will take a positive approach to the data and want to kind of create a better environment for the workforce. So a lot of good, a lot of upside to doing this. Basically, you're trying to say we're trying to create a competitive advantage against our competitor, or against our, within the industry, so we can hire the best people, keep the best people, and What else I want to mention here?
Well,
And really, yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of the questions we got too, Charles, was, how can leaders and managers, how do you get them to be more actively involved in the survey process and the follow-up?
Yeah.
And I think as they realize, right, that sometimes it's hard to find good people, it's hard to keep good people. The hiring process takes a long time. If you lose people, then people on your team are now more stressed until we hire somebody and get them up to speed. So when people see some of those things and realize if they can do things proactively, if they can take action on feedback, and maybe it's things they already knew, but maybe they'll get some insights here on the survey into things that they weren't really aware of and didn't realize now should be a priority. And that would be part of that process of keeping people and helping people stay with the organization.
Yeah, and I remember what I was gonna say, it's really an employees market right now. So there's still a gap between the number of open positions and people that are available. So you're trying to hire and recruit people. So if hiring and recruiting is difficult and your managers are complaining that it's hard to get good candidates, well, we need to create a great experience. So when people do join or look at our company, we have a good reputation about it being a place you want to work for. I'll touch on this maturity model. We'll provide the slides to this, and there's a recording too, so you can kind of revisit this. But essentially, when a client first starts or a company first starts doing an employee survey, we really usually see them at the measurement or commitment level, where there's a willingness essentially to take some action on the results. We're not quite sure what we're going to do with it, but typically that action or that emphasis comes from the senior leadership team. So we get the results back. We see that we need to improve communication or maybe growth opportunities for employees. That's a more reactive approach to your data. So you're using kind of a standard set of questions. You're responding to kind of what you see in the data. And then you're trying to get managers bought into this process. When you get to the management level, this is where you're providing manager reports to each manager with 5 or more responses, and doing some action planning locally. And maybe the first year you're kind of exposing them to the data. You're not requiring too much action. Maybe the second year you're saying, okay, everyone needs to create an action plan, or maybe those bottom 20% of folks that scored lower would create an action plan. But typically it takes a couple years to get all of your leaders really bought into this process and feeling like engagement and the people component is really important to your organization. Once that occurs, you get up to that integration and mastery level where now your people strategy is really kind of driving a lot of the initiatives and how you do business. And so you're kind of folding it in. It's one of the key priorities of your organization, and you're measuring it, and you're measuring against different initiatives you have in place that create a good environment. So it takes a while to kind of progress along these different pieces. Anything else, Thomas, you wanted to add on this one?
No, it's there's not like a bad place to start here. A lot of times when you start the first time with an engagement survey, you started that kind of early level measurement. You want to figure out what's our baseline here, what are some things that we should be focusing on, and then go from there.
So I touched on this before. We've got a slide, kind of an infographic here around the ROI of employee engagement. There's been a ton of research on this over the years. We've kind of gleaned some of those stats to kind of put here. A lot of times I like to use this just because if you have some leaders that are somewhat on the fence about, well, what is all this engagement or a great workplace or the employee experience about? We generally see if you have a more positive working environment, you're going to see better outcomes from your people. They're going to be more engaged in their work and want to do their best. And so there's been various studies done that show some of the advantages here. So this is what I like to just call our number slide. So the more engaged your workforce, the better performance outcomes you'll have.
There was a quick question here just about, where does financial wellness coaching, counseling come into all this? We see lots of turnover due to employers not providing affordable benefit options and contributions. Sometimes we ask directly on a survey, if an organization feels like that is an area of opportunity, something they kind of know is why people leave, they might say, do you feel like our benefits are competitive? Do you feel like we talked about compensation? It's always sort of a double-edged sword. If we ask about it and it scores low, I think employees would expect us to do something about it. Sometimes we can ask really specific things about benefits. So we can say, what are the top 3 things that you would like to see improved in the benefits package? And so, we can do some of those add-ons, and sometimes we look for it in the open-ended comments.
Yeah, and if you do offer that financial wellness coaching and counseling to your employees, that's helpful because sometimes they're not aware of the benefits or how to leverage them the best way. And they look at their package and might feel like, oh, this doesn't really meet my needs, when there could be some opportunities there. And so helping them kind of use or utilize what you're offering better is a good way to help them feel better about that scenario. So, but again, where you're in a competitive market where we're seeing healthcare costs increase, benefits are kind of decreasing, wages aren't increasing as fast as to keep up with the cost of living, that's going to be harder. People are going to be more incented to look around. All right, so we talk a lot about engagement, and then we talk about, well, what is it? What are we trying to measure? What does it really mean? And we wanted to kind of put this in context. I like Dilbert because they have a real cynical approach to the workplace, and here's a manager trying to explain what employee engagement is. And I think in a way, companies promote engagement to say, gosh, if we could get our people engaged, we'd make more money. So let's do that. That sounds good, without really understanding that you have to take a real sincere and authentic approach to improving the employee experience for your workers. So as we look at our definition here, this is our definition that we have in our book, as well as what we typically train leaders on. It's two parts. One is kind of a feeling. So you feel passionate and energetic and committed about your work, but then it also translates into an output of doing your best. And so generally, if you feel pretty good about your work, you want to contribute more and deliver better outcomes. We put it together in this model, though. So you have your kind of organization culture here, which is kind of what you build. It's your set of values, norms, and guiding beliefs. And really, when people talk about culture, it's the way we do things around here. And so everyone in your organization could describe your culture, and it might not be what you think it is. And so what we typically say is be deliberate about what your culture is and what you're trying to build, so people understand how to operate and make decisions and deliver to clients. That in turn creates a great employee experience. So if you have a good culture, people will respond positively, they'll have good experiences. So it's the impact of culture on employees. And if that's good, then you have engagement, which is more of a reward. So people are more engaged in their work. So engagement is kind of an outcome of other things that you do. When we think about how we measure different topics on the survey, we also break out this topic of satisfaction, which is very different from engagement. Satisfaction is really this idea of, it derives from people's perceptions around pay, training, safety, remote work, resources that they have to do their job. So kind of the basic necessities. You might think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where satisfaction are kind of the basic needs I need to have met to stay at this organization. They're not necessarily motivating, but they do drive retention because I'll stick around longer if I feel my pay is fair for the work I put in. Engagement, however, drives performance. So when you're engaged, you are going to feel motivated and passionate about your job and more excited about the work they do. And then Thomas, you want to cover the drivers of engagement here?
Yeah. So over the years, we've looked into what drives engagement. These are some of them. This is our magic framework. And so we found that if somebody has meaning in their job, for example, that tends to lead to engagement. And for some people, that's really important. These are not all elements that everybody prioritizes. For some people, it's autonomy. I want to be able to not be micromanaged. I want to be able to do my job the way that I see fit. Sometimes it's growth, right? Opportunities to both develop, have good training, learn new skill sets, maybe advance as well in the organization. Impact is around, do I feel like I'm making a difference? And sometimes it's intrinsic. Sometimes it's I make an impact because I work and I provide for my family. Sometimes you might work for an organization that provide a really unique product, something that gives values to other people, and a connection ties everything together. Sort of belonging, sort of connecting with the mission, the values of the organization. Sometimes just connecting with your team, with your supervisor, with those around you.
Excellent. Yeah, and so we'll kind of touch on this. We measure several different topics here typically when we do a survey, and we're trying to understand both components, because if the satisfaction elements aren't working, you need to fix those before people can really think about the higher level kind of engagement drivers that Thomas talked about. So let's talk about survey design. We had several kind of questions come up here about what to measure, how does it work? And so the purpose really of doing your annual survey is to establish a baseline. You're trying to gather kind of a big set of data and sort through it a bit to find out what's working or not working in the organization. You can also use it to really define and measure the factors that drive people performance. So what are we trying to create in our organization? What kind of experience are we trying to create? Let's ask questions about that to measure if we're living up to those things that we're trying to do. And then what you'll do at the end is identify some of the organization topics or themes or opportunities that you want to work on. So again, I mentioned like communication is typically one, or growth opportunities for employees. The fourth item here we've touched on is empowering your manager with team results. So not only is there an organization kind of action plan or emphasis, but we want managers really to take action and to respond to the results. And you're doing this really to promote organization change and to create alignment on these organization behaviors. Essentially, whatever you're measuring out there, your leaders are going to start aligning to and trying to create and focus on so that people agree more with those statements. And so in a way, you're defining the factors that drive success for the organization. And then, the other question comes up, well, okay, we do our annual survey, but what about other surveys and pulse surveys and, listening throughout the year? How do these impact, or is this too much surveying? Thomas, you want to talk about a couple of these items here and how to use them effectively?
Yeah, I think the main thing that we see here is obviously the two, we call them anchor surveys. That's sort of our bigger engagement survey. We ask a lot of different questions. We try to measure engagement. But, if we do that every year, there's 12 months where maybe we're not gathering any kind of other insights. And so that's where we have an opportunity to maybe it's just an anniversary survey. So that's typically what we send out on somebody's work anniversary. We ask them just a couple of questions. We ask them sometimes an ENPS question. And then we give them an open-ended text question to say, what's your experience like? And so we get that kind of continuous data throughout the year. We can run smaller pulse surveys if we just want to check in. Maybe we want to see, are we on target here? The actions that we took from the anchor survey or the engagement survey, have they paid off? Are they working? Are people resonating with some of the action plans? Or do we need to fine tune it a little bit before we run another survey? Onboarding exit comes in there too. We can automate some of those things where we just, we look into people's experience as they onboard, sometimes at 30 days, then at 90 days. And that allows us to create a much better and positive experience there. Exit surveys, that's always been tricky. Sometimes we do those in person, and then you can fill out the survey with the person. Sometimes we send them out, but a lot of different options here. Candidate surveys, sometimes we do a suggestion box, sort of an open-ended, link that's just on your HRIS or on your company website where employees can always go in and leave feedback. But just a lot of different options here. 360s, Charles, maybe you want to talk a little bit about 360s.
Yeah, I was going to say, 360 is specifically for leadership and understanding if people are living up to the, best practices when it comes to leadership competencies and behaviors. The other thing I was going to mention as you were talking about this is a lot of these surveys don't impact the entire population. So your anchor surveys, we're sending that out to everyone. Maybe there's a pulse survey that you do 6 months after the main survey that you send out to everyone as well. Your anniversary survey is only impacting like a 1/12 of the population as you go through this. So these different types of listening devices that you can use are not impacting the entire population and maybe aren't as political and disruptive as maybe your annual survey is. So your annual survey does a lot of heavy lifting. These other ones provide insight at these different touch points in people's experience or overall, life cycle.
Yeah, so people would really only get a survey, a couple of times a year. Maybe they're on their anniversary, very short little one. Maybe we do a pulse, but then it's that longer survey.
And we usually say that if you can respond to the feedback, then keep surveying. But if you're not going to respond to the feedback, people feel like, hey, we just did a survey and we didn't see anything because of, as a result, then you shouldn't be surveying that much. You got to slow down the pace a bit until you can really show there's some effort and some output around the results. All right. So then the other thing I wanted to address is maybe talk about survey design. So a lot of questions came in about this in terms of what do we do, or how long should the survey be? We're always worried that, oh gosh, are people going to abandon the survey, or, or how many questions are too long? Generally, we're asking about 45 to 55 questions on your annual survey. It takes about 8 to 10 minutes to complete. Most people complete the entire thing. Very few people abandon it or give up halfway through. And it's not a real burden. Once they sit down to take it, they appreciate, being able to go through the survey. It's pretty quick to kind of read through most of the scaled questions that you do. There's lots of different types around the job team. And then usually we say just ask maybe 2 comment questions at the end, what's working and what's not working. Because if you ask too many comment questions, that really lengthens the survey. So now people are feeling like, oh gosh, it takes like 2 minutes to complete a comment question. And here at the end, I'll talk more about demographics, but you don't necessarily want to ask, hey, what department do you work in? Or tell me your gender, or how long you've been working with the company. The more demographic questions you ask on the back end, the more people tend to feel like, uh-oh, somebody can identify me. So a lot of these things, what we want to do are use that data on the back end tied to an individual's responses, but still maintaining confidentiality. Eric asked here if there are duplicate but different questions to confirm a previous answer. We don't use those a lot on an employee survey because those are generally designed for a self-assessment. So if you're doing a self-assessment, there can be some bias involved as you're answering those questions. So you'll notice when you do a self-assessment, there's similar questions that are asked slightly differently. And what they're trying to do is see if there's consistency in your own individual personal response. Now, because we're sending out an employee survey to 100 people or 1,000 people, and we're asking the same question, we can determine the variance in response to that individual question by all the different people that answered it. And so you don't need to keep asking similar questions around similar topics. You just need to make sure you have a really good question that measures that topic well, and then you can get a real concrete, or I should say, real robust response to that answer. Anything else, Thomas, you want to add to this slide here?
No, I think we'll talk a little bit more about sort of the design of it, right? For that's sort of what I was going to mention here.
Yeah, I'll tee up on the next one then that we have, where we have kind of the different topics we can talk on. A lot of times clients will come to us and say, do you have comparisons for my 5 main competitors? And they'll give us a list or something, or 10 competitors. Here's the people in our industry. We want to see how we stack up. Very valid question. I would ask the same thing, because that would be ideal if you could get benchmarks and comparisons to the same questions you're asking your people to what your competitors are doing as well, and understand how you stack up. The problem is, I guess, Thomas, how likely is that to happen?
we would love for you to go talk to the competitors and get them to do a survey with us too, so we could provide that benchmark. No, it's just very unlikely that we have, your exact competitors in our benchmark. And so this slide, Charles, it shows, we do a 4-year rolling benchmark globally. We have a really large database of a lot of different industries, different organizations that we measure towards. 440 plus organizations that we look at there. I think it's 60 million responses that we've gathered. It's a 4-year rolling benchmark, so we look at it in that way to keep a little bit more consistency. But we can certainly go in and look at specific years as well. And then we have a lot of different industry benchmarks. We have a lot of different, unique things to be able to look at across different sectors.
Yeah, and what you'll find with most organizations as you work, with other vendors too, they probably have a set of maybe 50 questions that most of their clients are using regularly that they build their benchmark from. And then there's a variety of other topics. We have 173 total, where other clients have used this item, but not as much. And so it doesn't have as much data behind it. And so typically they'll encourage you to say, hey, use the standard ones. You'll get good benchmarking comparison, see how you stack up. If you get too customized with your questions, then we can't give you as robust comparisons, which is fine. So a lot of times we say, hey, use customized questions because you'll measure what's important to your organization. So don't be beholden to the benchmarks. In other words, you really want to make sure you're measuring what's important that drives success for your group as well. And you can do your best to get into a industry benchmark. It might not be the best fit, but it will give you some good comparison data. But yeah, we generally see executives get hung up on this when we're doing an executive presentation. We get a lot of questions about the benchmark, who's in there, how many people, and so it almost is like, if you can't get that, my 5 competitors, then, oh, this isn't, we kind of discount the data of their comparisons. But the global benchmark, and you'll find this with every vendor, is very reliable and a really good comparison overall. It just tells you if you're doing better or worse than what we typically measure. So good survey questions. This comes up a lot too. And we basically have kind of 3 pieces of advice here. One is make sure they're specific. We talk about face validity a lot, which basically means if you read the question, or if anyone read the question, would they get what you're asking? In other words, there shouldn't be any question about, well, maybe somebody's going to interpret it this way, or when I looked at the question, I was thinking of this. So if you kind of focus group a question with a group of people and you're getting various responses on what they think it means, it's not a good question. It's got to be specific. It's got to measure the topic that you're really interested in understanding. And it's got to be short and concise. If it's too long and wordy, we talk about double-barreled questions, it has 2 different thoughts or ideas in there. Well, now I'm not sure what I'm rating. Am I rating, communication, or am I rating the frequency of communication in the organization? Another example is when you're asking questions about supervisors, make it more specific. My immediate supervisor, because a lot of times you might say, well, my supervisor is this other person. My direct manager is this person. Who am I answering this question about? Relevancy here is topics that drive the employee experience. And so again, if you're looking at a set of questions and you see some that just don't make sense to your people, then you don't need to answer or use them. If there's others, though, that really important to your success that aren't there, then let's make sure we include or add some questions there. And then actionable just means if we got a low score on this question, what would we do? So sometimes there's some questions that are less actionable. I'll give you an example. I feel like I belong here. If you get a low score there, sometimes you might read that and say, well, gosh, what does that mean? Belonging has a broader meaning. Now, it's a good outcome question about an overall experience, but it's not as actionable. So you might have some that are more outcome statements as opposed to action items. And the other 2 points I'll just say is with the 5-point agreement scale, that's the typical measurement from strongly disagree to strongly agree. That's an industry standard. If you use all of your questions around that scale, it allows you it's a lot easier to analyze and compare the results in the back end. If you're using different scales, 10-point scale here, a different scale here, various types of questions, it is a mess and really hard to analyze your results. So you want to be careful that you're consistent there. And then comment items are great if you don't quite know what you're trying to do. So for example, we don't understand how to improve collaboration. Let's ask a comment question about collaboration there.
Yeah, and we had a question here. It kind of goes
Yeah.
into what we have on the slide. Both, what can we do to ensure that the survey questions are relevant and comprehensive? Should we use standard survey or customize it? And sort of a mix there. We want, if you've just gone through an acquisition, maybe we want to add a question about how do people feel about the acquisition, or did we just bring people back into the office 3 days? How is that impacting people? If we sort of leave things out that are current, then people might feel, people are like, why are they not asking about this? And I think we'd want feedback. How did that? We just implemented this new system. How's that impacting people? And then one of the customization things that we often do, even with our standard survey, is, you might use the word manager more in your organization than supervisor. Very easy to change that. Some organizations say people leader, and that's one of those things we always change. And instead of saying, this organization communicates well, we might say, the name of your organization.
Or the department does.
Yeah, so we like to do some customization where we can still use our benchmark database, but it feels a little bit more personable and a little bit more specific to that company or organization.
So then let's get into some more specifics here. So what topics should be measured? So we joke around a lot because, there is a question out there about having a best friend at work, which is more of an outcome statement. It's hard to action on, so it might not be as useful in terms of using that as a topic, even though it might give us an indication of how engaged people are if they have a best friend at work. Thomas, you want to talk about some of these and how we use them and what kind of outcomes we see?
Yeah, I thought you were going to ask if I was your best friend, but we'll talk.
Obviously.
We can talk about that later. Yeah, so these are the different topics that we like to look at. Enablement, it's one of those. The example here is the amount of work I'm expected to do is reasonable. Some of this is about training, development. It is sort of your more tangible, maybe a little bit easier for people to answer questions. And it's often that satisfaction baseline. We want to make sure that satisfaction baseline is in order before we really start measuring engagement. We often look at collaboration, communication. We found that those are important aspects. Voice, do people feel like they can speak up? Do they feel like this feedback, something's going to happen with it? Do they feel like their ideas are listened to? Charles mentioned DEI. We have sort of culture DEI as a mix there. Sometimes we ask very specific questions about DEI. Sometimes we're a little bit more broad there. And then the other things you'll see is we ordered it in the right way: meaning, autonomy, growth, impact, connection, our magic framework. So we look at some of those drivers to see, are they existing for people? Are they having a sense of meaning and purpose? Are they having a level of autonomy? Are they feeling growth opportunities and so forth? Then we usually have a supervisor and a team section. And we will, look at, see our team dynamics working, our supervisors doing a good job in giving feedback, providing communication. Are they helping people develop and grow? So a lot of different ways to look at the survey. We'll then look at these different themes on the back end.
Yeah.
Judy just asked, will we get a copy of the slides or recording? Yes, we can send out both. So I think you'll automatically get that. Actually, we'll send an email out with the recording and the slides.
Rachel just asked, is there value in engaging employees in the discussion of what topics to include on the survey? So we typically caution our clients not to design their survey by committee because it gets really long. Everyone has a pet topic that they want to include. Typically, you do want to shop it around a bit, maybe with your senior leaders to get buy-in to make sure we're kind of covering topics that are important. Some clients, though, don't. Some clients are like, listen, if we do that, we'll get all kinds of feedback. We've done some exercises with clients or with focus groups. You can do some focus groups before the survey to understand what are the top issues or topics that people are concerned about. And then you can go back and say, and make sure you have those types of questions on your survey so that you're really getting to the issues that are most important for your employees. But generally, most employees, they'll, if you shop around the survey too much, you'll get overwhelmed with ideas and suggestions. So again, use kind of a set of questions. We normally say, hey, here's the standard set you can start from. Let's make a few edits to this, and then go from there. And then let me address Steve's question in terms of what we do with the feedback when we get to that section here in a moment.
Yeah, I'll keep that one in mind as well.
Yeah. All right. So a couple of ways to measure different topics. So we've talked about engagement. How do you measure engagement? Well, if you look at these questions, these kind of break the rules that I just said before. They're not actionable statements. These are outcome statements, we call them, because we're trying to measure a person's overall passion and motivation towards their work. And so as people respond to these questions, they're telling us what they really think about the job itself. And you'll notice that we have the ability to compare it to what we measured back in 2024. So this 82% indicates that it's 8 points higher than what this organization measured previously. And it's right on par with what we see in our global benchmark in terms of enjoying the day-to-day work I perform. And then it kind of goes down a bit. So most days looking forward to my work, well, not as much agreement there, even though we're seeing more positive responses overall. The way we look at engagement, though, is we break people into 4 profiles or groups. And so generally, if people responded to those 4 questions as an individual and said strongly agree, okay, we say you're fully engaged in your work. And so we have a little definition here, what that means. Those that are more on average agreeing with those questions, we say you're a key contributor. We combine those 2 groups together to get an overall engagement index of 82% of your population is engaged. Now, that seems pretty high, but that's really more, I think, descriptive of what's going on in your organization. For example, Gallup might just look at the fully engaged population. They'll usually say anyone that's kind of responding strongly agree to all of these statements, they're fully engaged. And that's where they might have like 30% of your population is only 30% of people are engaged. 14% really are on the fence when we look at this data, where they're kind of in this opportunity group. They responded more neutral to those questions. And then there's a few people that are disagreeing with those statements. They're just not having a good experience overall for several reasons. So if we can do this and look at this, then we can create demographics based on these groups. We can say, okay, what's the profile of those that are fully engaged versus those that are in this opportunity group? How are they experiencing the organization differently? What's working or not working for each of them? If we look at the opportunity group now as a demographic, we found 73 people that were here. We can sort the data and we can say, okay, now what's not working for them? What are their lowest scores? So what's bothering folks and maybe detracting from their ability to engage? And as you look at these lists of questions, you'll see that meaning and purpose scored low, opportunities for professional growth, making progress on important projects or initiatives. That's a kind of a sense of impact. And then working across departments and functions. They're also less likely to stay with the organization. So by measuring engagement using a set of questions that gives you a robust data set to work with, you can do some driver analysis there. It allows you to create demographics or profiles where you can then look at these populations and see what's working or not working. So that's kind of why we have those statements that we're using in that way. And then the next topic comes up is how we measure turnover and risk. So typically we pivot off of a question like number 38 here, this choose to remain topic, where we're trying to understand what's people's intent to stay. Now you can see this and break it out by all kinds of different demographic groups. And so you'd notice, oh, the security group, only 55% of people in that group are agreeing with that statement. In fact, 27% disagreed, which would indicate that there's a pretty high risk that we're going to see some turnover in that department overall. So this kind of tells you what we look at. And what happens is when we look at this data 6 months later, if you give us for example, we'll tell clients, hey, send us a list of people that left your organization since the last survey. We'll plug it back in as a demographic. And what we'll see is question 38, those people that responded less favorably to that are more likely to leave in 6 months from the organization. So it's a really good indicator. And then another outcome type statement or question, and this is one of the questions that came up from the feedback we gathered before the webinar, is what do you do with like ENPS? Thomas, we were talking about this. What's your take on ENPS?
Yeah, for organizations, especially when you measure customer, just net promoter scores from your customers, sometimes you would say, we'll kind of want to see that for our employees as well. And so often we ask the question, how likely are you to recommend this organization as a great place to work? Once in a while, it'll be, would you recommend working here to a friend or family member? That gets a little bit more personal. And then, as you know, or most of you probably know, ENPS or NPS scores, the 7 and the 8s is sort of a neutral group. We don't take that group into consideration. We're really just looking at the 9s and 10s that we get. And then we're saying anything 6 or below, those are our detractors. And so, here's a measurement, 28, actually a really good ENPS score. ENPS goes from a negative 100 to positive 100. So it's sort of a 200-point scale that we look at. But it's just one way to look at the data. I think it's interesting. But I do think sometimes people, even if they're very engaged, they might still give us a 7 or an 8. It's not necessarily somebody that's fully engaged that gives us a 10, because they might have, they might say, well, I really like working here, but I've also been here for a while. I kind of know what I'm doing, but there's some risk and there's some things I don't like. So I wouldn't say, hey, come over and work here to everybody, but I generally, feel pretty good about it. So it's sort of it's an interesting question. I do like using it. But there's always some variability here.
We don't use it very frequently. In fact, we use it on our 5-point scale. We just basically say, how likely would you recommend this is a great place to work? And we look at that data, but it is an outcome statement. It's more about kind of the organization confidence. If you're using NPS for customer sat internally, and your managers are really understand that and use that, this is another way to kind of look at the data and maybe from your people component and add that in. But if you have to educate people on ENPS, it's probably not worth using this as another indicator. So if it's already kind of something you know and use and familiar with, great. Otherwise, it probably won't add as much value to the experience. We get a lot of questions about trending and how often should I change the survey? How often do we change questions? Some of our clients, they will tell us, nope, we don't want to change the survey. We want exact same questions year over year. We're very concerned about trending. We've got some bonuses and stuff attached to this, so we don't want to touch the questions. And we kind of don't like that because we would prefer to kind of measure the current topics and use the most current questions that are really getting us good data. So generally we'd say what happens is if you're using the same question set, your managers will get bored with the data. Your managers will say, we keep measuring the same thing. I keep seeing the same scores. What do you want me to do here? So this 3-year itch idea is that after 3 years, generally that's when we see clients and leaders wanting to change the survey because they're like, okay, what else you got? What's new? What should we be doing differently now? Because we've kind of conquered this set of questions, so to speak. Another thing is to kind of measure the impact of organization changes you might be going through. And then we kind of call these more advanced concepts like understanding and measuring how people respond to your values, the culture of the organization, and then the organization people networks, like who are the biggest influencers as well. Anything else you want to add here, Thomas?
No, I mean, I think we've designed a standard survey, sort of our starting point that is, in some ways timeless. That sounds maybe cheesy, but I think there are questions that have worked over many years. We fine-tuned them a little bit, and sometimes we'll bring in topics that we've seen come up. And so obviously the trending is really helpful, but, sometimes we want to add some things. And to the point earlier, some of the relevant things that have happened in our organization, if we've seen major changes, we might want to measure that. We might not want to ask feedback on that specific topic.
Yeah.
So.
All right, so I got to move a little quicker. I'm just looking at our time here. We got a lot to cover. So let's get into survey admin best practices. We get a lot of questions about this. And I'll talk briefly about this. Normally, if you're going to kick this off, you want to give yourself a decent runway. Some of our clients, we'll start 3 months ahead. But normally you need about 6 weeks to kind of get the survey set up and get your employee information hierarchy set up, your employee file. 2 weeks to collect the feedback, and then about 3 to 8 weeks to really roll out the results. We'll talk about that in more detail. Best time to run a survey? Well, you could run a survey anytime, obviously, but we usually say, when are leaders going to be in a position to act on the data? Like, are they going to be meeting at a big, year-end meeting or something like that, where it makes sense to get this data into their hands as they do planning? Okay, well, let's back up from that date and plan when the survey should run. Another time is, when are we less busy? When are people, when is the employee, work cycle a little bit down, so we're not stressing people out? And then, should we conduct a survey if we just did a layoff, or if there are major changes, or if we just changed the remote work policy? Aren't we going to see lower scores as a result? Well, the answer is probably yes, but it's also a really great time to listen to your employees and show that you care and that you're trying to respond in a positive way to the disruption that just occurred. And then last bullet point, survey as frequently as you can respond to the data. So you want to make sure that you're doing something as a result of the survey. Otherwise, you're going to lose confidence in the process. Confidentiality. This one comes up a lot, where you get people that say, gosh, I don't trust this, or this is going to get back to me. What I typically see is you always will have people that are skeptical and worried about confidentiality. You'll never convince everyone. And some of those will be your managers, and they'll be your loudest critics as you do the survey. But even though we hear this time and time again, and we'll even see it in the comments on the survey, like, I don't trust this survey, I think you know who I am. We never release that, right? All that data, is rolled up for 5 or more responses. And it's a small percent of your population that's going to feel that way. You'll never kind of convince everyone that this is going to be fully confidential and anonymous. What else on here, Thomas, comes up or that you want to talk about?
Well, I just like the meme, Liam Neeson here and Taken saying, hey, you didn't fill out the survey. I don't know who you are, but we don't know who those people are. And that's why we always call it confidential and not anonymous, because we are collecting some of that data on the back end. We want to know what department that response came from. We want to know, what tenure did that person have? because that allows us really great insights to say, oh, look, it's our less than 1 year, tenured employees that have a different experience. Let's see if we can figure something out there. Or it's the finance department, something is going on there. And to Charles's point, there's always going to be a little bit of apprehension. Maybe people had a bad experience in a previous organization, but we never release individual data. And 5 is usually our confidentiality threshold, meaning if a certain function department didn't have more than 5 people that responded, we wouldn't show the data. They would still roll up to the overall data, but we wouldn't we wouldn't look at it. And so this is probably a good time. Steve mentioned earlier, what techniques do you have to address employees' personal attacks if they attack management or something in the comments.
Yeah.
We do say in the usually on the survey, if you have anything kind of, harassment or something you need to really report, this is not the place for it, because this is confidential. And so, we can't really go back and respond to a specific attack or some kind of personal thing. Our most common open-ended text question there is, what can we do to make this a better place to work? So we sort of frame it in that way, give us something constructive here. Give us something that we can action on.
And sometimes we see those comments and you have the ability to, edit them out or remove them. If we feel like it's not a constructive comment and it's just, someone bagging on someone, you can also remove those.
Yeah, and we have a new feature where we can summarize the comments using AI. And so, I think there's always value for a couple of people. Maybe it's the CEO, maybe it's the senior leaders that get verbatim comments for their specific department. But if we want to give comments to somebody that just has 10 people or even 5 people, we can do now an AI summary. So you don't get the verbatim comments, but they still get some insight into that feedback in the comment section.
Yeah, that's a good point. So again, it's a trust building exercise. The biggest thing is if you do something as a result of the data, people will feel more confident. And if people don't see anything bad occur because of the survey, then they're like, oh, hey, we did the survey last year. Nobody got blacklisted or got in trouble for their feedback. So I trust it this year. And so you see some more candid feedback. Increasing participation, there's a lot of things you can do. Generally, we see about 82% of the employee population take the survey. Now, if you're in a manufacturing environment or you have a lot of people out in the field, not at a computer, you might, get 75% participation, which is still really good and robust overall. And what you want to do is just encourage people to participate. So if people believe something good's going to happen as a result of the data, like we're seeing in the meme here, then they'll be more encouraged to take the survey. But reminders are really important. The more reminders you send, the better. Scheduling some time for people that work shifts so they actually are set apart to kind of take the survey as opposed to just doing it whenever. And then you can monitor and see which groups have high or low participation, reach out to some managers and some departments to say, hey, encourage your people to take it. As a last resort, you can extend the deadline. But generally, if you get 75% participation, you have a really robust data set. And depending upon the size of your organization, if you got 50% participation and 1,000 people in your organization, you're going to have less than 1% margin of error in terms of the data overall. So that data from 50% of your employees represents the other 50% of employees really well. We wouldn't see much variation or difference in the scores. It breaks down a bit, though, when you get to less than 100 employees. So you'll see that there's greater variation if you only got 50% participation out of 100 people in the organization. Then, maybe it's going to be more directional and not as conclusive in terms of the data overall. All right, let me zip forward. I want to get to some of the things about reporting here. So, and maybe we'll kind of end on this too, because there's a lot we can say. But when you're interpreting your data, what are you going to do with it? Survey results are in, gosh, we went down by 2 points. Now we're depressed. What happened? What did we do wrong or whatever? So we want to look at the data points here and really understand what's going on. Thomas and I, we can tell a lot when we look at your overall score and your engagement score. If it's pretty high compared to what we see in our benchmarks, we can generally say that you've got a good thing going on in your organization and most people like working there. And you'll probably have little things you can do to make some improvements. If you're below our benchmarks, there's going to be some clear opportunities that will kind of stand out in your data. So you sort through the highs and lows. You look for key themes. You look at your demographic comparisons to see if there's big differences in some of those areas. And then you mine the comments for insights. And I'll give you a quick tutorial or example of how we might approach the data. I'll just look at this sample data set here that I've got pulled up. And you can see that 78% is a pretty good score overall. That would be on average with our benchmarks with all the questions on the survey. That's up 2 points from what we measured before. So there's good things going on there. Maybe we saw stronger improvements on some of these questions. And then you can kind of quickly go through and sort through some of the data here to see where some of the biggest differences are. And what I like to do is, I'll try to make this bigger so we can all see, is, you do a quick sort here. And, everyone wants to look at the lowest scoring questions first. So what are the low scoring topics? What do you need to work on? Well, there's a question about collaborating across departments and functions. There's being responsive to ideas. There's communication. We're seeing lower perceptions, less agreement, but we did see improvement on question 32. It went up. So we're making progress. So that's some good news there on these statements. In fact, all of these low scoring statements went up slightly from what we measured before. So as you're looking at this, Thomas, I guess I'll get your perspective. What are you seeing occur as kind of a theme in the data here for their low scores?
Yeah, so like you just mentioned it, collaboration, communication, there's some of that employee voice in there. And that's probably where I would dive into that specific question. So I would click on, the cross-functional collaboration question. And I would look at, how does that look across? Now we look at that specific question. And you can see here, there are some people that strongly agreed. There's certainly a lot of agreement as well. How does that differ across departments? Are there some specific departments that stick out as having, more challenges with cross-functional communication? Are there some departments that are doing really well? Is there something we can learn here from a specific department? And are there a couple other departments where we need to do something a little bit more here? It's interestingly, we have HR, we have marketing, we have security, slightly lower. There's some variance here. It does seem like all of these departments we could do something. And this is just one of those topics that is a challenge for a lot of organizations. Cross-functional collaboration is almost an art form sometimes. We have to figure out, what do we do there? What specific things can we do to work a little bit more effectively together? So.
And I think this is a good example to say, is this a problem across the entire organization, or is it more localized and specific to work on as well?
So sometimes we'll see a specific question, like it's across the board, and sometimes it's very clearly, a specific department that has something going on.
Yeah, and I'll quickly jump to kind of what we saw in the overall results. And so we can see, as we mine the comments, there were 43 comments out of all the data here that talked about collaboration. And so usually your leaders will say, well, what should we do about collaboration? Well, here's what we're seeing in terms of mentions from people and what they're saying about it, what's not working. And there's also usually suggestions on what you can do to improve. And so this is where you can really kind of mine the data and use this to really focus in on some of these topics and create some action plans based on your data on this particular topic around collaboration. So that's a quick kind of view to kind of give you a feel for how do you approach the data. Now you can really get into the weeds here. You could look at several different demographic comparisons, but generally you're trying to identify one or two key themes. What are the populations where it makes sense or where there's some biggest differences in some of the data? What are the high scores, low scores themes? We'll look at engagement. So there's a lot of things you can do in terms of analyzing the comments, looking at the summary to really kind of paint the picture. With all this data, though, you're really trying to get back to the executives. What are the one or two things we can work on? Because you can overwhelm them with all of these data points. But if you can give them a nice quick list and say, hey, here's our strengths, here's the areas we need to focus on, that's really what they're looking for at the end of the day to really make some improvement in the organization. We got to package it kind of nicely so they don't feel too overwhelmed about what they're trying to work on. And then the next piece I'll just say is, getting data into the hands of your managers. There's a heavy lift here in terms of doing this a lot of times. And you're just trying, again, takes a couple of years sometimes to get all your managers on board with this, but helping them use the results to action plan locally is important. Some will have really high scores and might not need to do much. Others will have some clear opportunities. Let me, I want to finalize. I see we have just like a minute left. And what I'm really trying to set up here, well, I want to make sure we address any other questions. Is there anything else, Thomas, that you wanted to talk about before we wrap up here? In terms
Yeah,
of the
no, I
question
think,
list?
yeah, we're running up against the clock here. So if there are specific questions, feel free to reach out to me or Charles, to DecisionWise in general. We're happy to jump on a call and discuss as well.
Yeah, and we'll continue this too. We get a lot of traction on these topics and questions, so maybe we'll talk more about action planning by itself on the next session we do. We also do a more extensive training. Like, we've kind of pulled out nuggets from the certification training that we do. And so there's a lot more we can share and provide, and samples and all kinds of stuff too, from this training program that we do with other HR leaders. So just want to encourage you to use that. I want to thank everybody though for the feedback you gave us, for the questions you have. We're going to follow up on a few more that came in on the chat here after the session. But again, thanks for all your participation and attendance today. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to having you join us on a future session. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody.